Okay, so you want to understand how someone escaped Tuol Sleng. You've seen the photographs. You have read the accounts of survivors who walked out alive, who eventually sat in courtrooms and gave testimony, who wrote books. And somewhere in the process of reading those accounts, you have started to build a picture in your mind of what escape looked like. A desperate run across a dark courtyard, a guard who looked the other way, a gap in the wire, a moment of chaos, a choice made in the dark. Here is the problem. That picture is fundamentally inaccurate, not merely flawed, but entirely false. Because the actual mechanics of surviving S-21 had almost nothing to do with physical escape in the way most people imagine it, and everything to do with a set of brutal, specific, and almost completely invisible variables that almost no prisoner could control. Understanding those variables is the only way to understand what actually happened inside that building. Before we talk about survival, we need to agree on the numbers. Because the numbers are where most people's understanding of S-21 breaks down entirely. The facility operated from 1975 to 1979, approximately 4 years under the administration of a Khmer Rouge cadre known as Dutch. During that period, the prison processed somewhere between 17,000 and 20,000 individual prisoners. Of those 17,000 to 20,000 people, the number of adults confirmed to have survived the facility and lived to see liberation is 7. 7 people. That is a survival rate of between 0.035 and 0.041%. Those are not rounding errors. That is the structure of the place working exactly as designed. The facility itself was a former secondary school, Tuol Svai Prey High School, located in the Tuol Sleng neighborhood of Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge took control of the buildings in 1975 and converted them systematically into a detention and interrogation complex. The physical conversion was deliberate and layered. Classrooms became mass holding cells for lower priority prisoners, with large groups shackled together on the floor with a single leg iron running through a long metal bar. Smaller rooms became individual isolation cells, measuring roughly 0.8 meters by 2 meters, barely enough space to lie flat. The school's exterior was wrapped in electrified barbed wire. Guard towers were positioned at intervals across the perimeter. The windows of the upper floors were enclosed in a dense mesh of wire fencing that prevented any contact with the outside. Every architectural feature of the original school that suggested openness or movement was methodically sealed. The security architecture went beyond the physical barriers. The staff-to-prisoner ratio at S-21 was exceptionally high compared to most detention facilities in any era. Estimates from the tribunal proceedings place the guard force at anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 personnel over the course of the prison's operation, including interrogators, administrative staff, and guards working in rotating shifts. Prisoners were kept shackled to their beds or to the floor at all times except during interrogation sessions. Movement inside the facility was controlled to a degree that made independent navigation of the building essentially impossible for anyone not wearing a Khmer Rouge uniform. The guards were themselves subject to internal surveillance. Dutch's administration monitored staff behavior closely, and guards who showed leniency toward prisoners were considered politically suspect. The incentive structure for the people holding the keys ran entirely in one direction. So what did survival actually require? The 7 confirmed adult survivors did not escape in the physical sense. They were not extracted. They did not tunnel out. They were kept alive because they had something the facility's administration needed. The documented cases are consistent on this point. Vann Nath was a painter. Dutch wanted paintings of Pol Pot, large formal portraits to be distributed and displayed. Vann Nath was identified in the intake process as someone who could produce them. He was pulled from the general population and given materials. Bou Meng was also a painter. His story follows the same structure almost exactly. Chum Mey was a mechanic. The typewriters used by the administrative staff for documentation broke down regularly. Chum Mey could repair them. These were not lucky accidents. These were calculated decisions made by the administration based on a specific calculus of utility versus risk. Here is what that calculus looked like from the inside. Every prisoner at S-21 arrived already classified as an enemy of the revolution. The baseline assumption upon intake was guilt. The interrogation process was not designed to determine whether a prisoner was guilty. It was designed to produce a confession that confirmed guilt and extracted the names of additional individuals to be arrested. The timeline from arrival to execution was, for the vast majority of prisoners, between 1 and 3 months. That was the standard operating cycle. Being kept alive beyond that window required the administration to make an active decision to override the standard process. For the painters and the mechanic, that decision was made. For everyone else, the process ran on schedule. The physical conditions made independent survival attempts close to impossible even before accounting for the security layers. Prisoners in the mass holding cells were fed twice daily, small portions of rice gruel insufficient to maintain body weight over time. The documentation from survivor testimonies describes progressive physical deterioration beginning within the first weeks of detention. By the point most prisoners had been inside S-21 for 60 days, their physical condition had degraded to a degree that would have made sustained physical exertion extremely difficult. The combination of malnutrition, forced immobility from the shackling arrangements, and the psychological effects of systematic interrogation meant that even if a physical gap in the security had presented itself, most T prisoners would not have had the physical capacity to move through it. There were attempted escapes. The prison records, which Dutch's administration maintained with unusual precision, document instances of prisoners attempting to break free or resist. Resistance during interrogation was handled with escalated force. Escape attempts resulted in immediate execution and, in some cases, collective punishment of the cell block the prisoner had been held in. The documentation function of the administration was itself a form of deterrent. Prisoners knew that their names, their photographs, their family connections, and the names they had already provided during interrogation were all on file. Even if a prisoner had somehow cleared every physical barrier, they were escaping into a city entirely under Khmer Rouge control, where an ethnic Cambodian of working age without documentation and without a recognizable agricultural role had no viable cover identity. The end of S-21 came from outside. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese military forces entered Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge administration of the city collapsed rapidly. In the days immediately preceding the Vietnamese arrival, as it became clear that the regime was losing control of the capital, the guards at S-21 executed the remaining prisoners still held in the facility. When Vietnamese soldiers reached the building, they found 14 bodies chained to metal bed frames in the interrogation rooms. Those 14 individuals had been alive when the guards fled. The 7 survivors who lived were outside the facility when liberation occurred, having been moved or were elsewhere on the grounds in circumstances that varied by individual. None of them walked out through a gate they had opened themselves. The arithmetic of those 4 years is worth sitting with directly. Between 17,000 and 20,000 people entered S-21. 7 adults confirmed survived. That means for every 2,500 people who passed through the intake process, approximately 1 person was still alive when the Vietnamese arrived. Some children were brought to the facility with arrested parents. The documentation on their fates is incomplete, and the actual number of people who moved through the building during its operational period may be higher than the primary intake records reflect. The directional reality does not shift. This was a facility designed and administered to produce one outcome for almost every person inside it. Dutch was arrested in 1999 and tried before the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the tribunal established to prosecute senior Khmer Rouge leadership for crimes against humanity. He was convicted in 2010 and sentenced to life imprisonment after an initial sentence of 35 years was extended on appeal. During the tribunal proceedings, the 3 surviving witnesses who testified in person, Vann Nath, Bou Meng, and Chum Mey, gave accounts of what they had seen and experienced inside the facility. Vann Nath died in 2011. Dutch died in 2020 while still serving his sentence. Bou Meng and Chum Mey remained alive as of the most recent public record and continued to speak about their experiences at the facility, which has operated since 1980 as a genocide museum. The question people most often ask about S-21 is some version of why more people did not find a way out. The answer is not that people lack the will. The answer is that the system was engineered with the specific goal of making exit impossible for anyone the administration had not chosen to keep. The physical barriers, the staffing ratios, the physical deterioration of prisoners, the citywide political control that eliminated any external environment a survivor could have moved into, the documentation that tracked every name and face through the intake process. These were not separate obstacles. They were a single integrated design. The 7 people who survived did so because the administration found a narrow use for them and made an exception to a process that had no other exceptions built into it.